Hi, welcome back. Our previous lesson was on consumer and producer surplus. Today we'll be looking at market efficiency. So markets are the central organizing institutions of our lives. They determine what products are made, how much is produced, who makes what, and who gets what, and what the price will be. Now, most economists prefer market-based economies because they create the largest possible amount of economic surplus. They do so by providing efficient answers to three central questions: who makes what, who gets what, and how much gets bought and sold. So let's explore how markets answer these questions. So the first question that we'll be looking at is who makes what? Now, in answering this question, one primary thing we have to know is that efficient production minimizes cost. So efficient production occurs when we produce a given level of output at the lowest possible cost or at the lowest marginal cost. So let's consider two essential suppliers in the market of apples: Big Land and Joy Farm. Now this graph shows the marginal cost for the two firms. This curve shows Joy Farm's marginal cost, and this curve shows Big Land's marginal cost. Now when the price of apple is 2, Joy Farm produces 6 million pounds of apples, and Big Land produces 14 million pounds of apples. Now the total apples produced in this market is 6 million from Joy Farm plus 14 million from Big Land, which is 20 million. So let's assume that we asked Joy Farm to produce a larger share than they are producing currently. Total cost will rise because Joy Farm will produce these extra apples at a marginal cost bigger than 2, perhaps at 2.5. Even though Big Land could have produced those extra apples at a marginal cost lower than 2, perhaps 1.8. So this is inefficient because it raises the total cost of producing the entire 20 million pounds of apples. Alternatively, what if you ask Joy Farm to produce fewer apples and Big Land to produce more? That is also inefficient because the total cost will rise and Big Land will produce those extra apples at a marginal cost bigger than 2, perhaps 2.2. Even though Joy Farm could have produced those extra apples at a marginal cost lower than 2, perhaps 1.5. So this shows that any production plan other than the one caused by the forces of demand and supply is inefficient and will raise cost. So in answering the question of who makes what, the primary thing that market does, it distributes production across firms that minimize cost. So this is made possible by the presence of competition in the market. Now that we know how market answers the question of who makes what, let's look at how market answers the question of who gets what. So in answering the question of who gets what, the primary thing that market does, or the primary answer that market looks for, is that efficient allocation maximizes benefits. An efficient allocation occurs when goods are allocated to create the largest economic surplus from the allocation, which requires that each good goes to the person who gets the highest marginal benefit from it. So now let's consider two apple buyers, Paula and James. So this curve shows their various marginal benefits. So this curve will show Paula's marginal benefit and this will show James's marginal benefit. When the price is 2, James buys 6 pounds of apples and Paula buys 14 pounds of apple. Giving James fewer apples and Paula more apples will be inefficient. This is because Paula's marginal benefit from extra apple is less than 2. So in this example, Paula's marginal benefit from extra apple is just 1.8, which is less than 2. However, James is foregoing apples from which he could get a marginal benefit that is greater than 2, which is 2.5 in this example. Alternatively, giving Paula fewer apples and James more apple will also be inefficient and will reduce the economic surplus. So now let's look at why this is the case. If we give James extra apple, his marginal benefit from getting an extra apple is 1.5, which is less than 2 in this case. However, Paula will forgo apples from which she could get a marginal benefit greater than 2, perhaps 2.2 in this case. So this is how the market answers the question, who gets what? It allocates goods to people with the highest marginal benefit. Marginal benefit in this case can be measured by a consumer's willingness to pay for a good. Now let's look at how market answers the question of how much gets bought and sold. Now in answering this question, we have to know that efficient quantity is the quantity that produces the largest possible economic surplus. So based on the rational rule for the market, it says that you have to produce until your marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. So now let's look at this graph to analyze how market decides how much gets bought and sold. So in a well-functioning market, the supply curve is also the marginal cost curve of the market, and the demand curve is also the marginal benefit curve. So we have our supply curve, which is also our marginal cost curve in the market, and our demand curve, which is also our marginal benefit curve in the market. So at the point where supply equals demand, equilibrium occurs, and this is the point where marginal benefit is also equal to marginal cost. On this graph, we have this shown at point A. A corresponding equilibrium price is this, and equilibrium quantity is also that. So at quantities less than the equilibrium, the marginal benefit to buyers of another good exceeds the marginal cost of sellers. Now let's look at this on the curve. If there is a quantity that is below the equilibrium quantity, then at this quantity, the marginal benefit to buyers. So this point is marginal benefits to buyers. And at the same quantity, the supply curve here shows the marginal costs to sellers. So we can see that if there's any quantity, assuming Q1, below the equilibrium quantity, the marginal benefits to buyers will be more than the marginal cost to sellers. So this means that consumers are gaining more from the consumption of the good than it costs producers to produce the good. So this is an inefficient quantity. So it will be better for markets to increase the quantity to the point where marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. So in other words, when the quantity is less than the equilibrium quantity, buyers are willing to pay more for each product than it costs sellers to produce it. So now let's look at quantities above the equilibrium quantity. So at quantities greater than the equilibrium quantity, the marginal cost to sellers exceeds the marginal benefit to buyers. This means that it costs sellers more to produce each good than buyers are willing to pay for it. So on this graph, at quantity Q2, so we have demand curve here showing marginal benefit to consumers, and on the supply curve, we have marginal cost of producing that good. So you can see that at quantity Q2, marginal cost is larger than marginal benefit. And this shows that it costs producers more to produce each good than consumers are willing to pay for it. So this is also an inefficient quantity. So market will be more efficient if it reduces production up to the point of equilibrium quantity. So the equilibrium quantity resulting from the forces of demand and supply is the quantity that maximizes economic surplus. An economic surplus is measured by this entire triangle here. So this is our economic surplus. Now we can see from this graph that the point where the economic surplus is maximized is at the equilibrium quantity. So market is more efficient, or market is efficient if it produces at the point that maximizes economic surplus. So that is, competitive market leads to the efficient quantity of any good that can be produced. So this is all that we have for our lesson on market efficiency. Our next lesson will be on market failure. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.